The Whigs were a political faction and then a political party in the parliaments of England, Scotland, Great Britain and the United Kingdom. Between the 1680s and 1850s, they contested power with their rivals, the Tories. The Whigs' origin lay in constitutional monarchism and opposition to absolute monarchy. The Whigs played a central role in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and were the standing enemies of the Stuart kings and pretenders, who were Roman Catholic. The Whigs took full control of the government in 1715, and remained totally dominant until King George III, coming to the throne in 1760, allowed Tories back in. The Whig supremacy was enabled by the Hanoverian succession of George I in 1714 and the failed Jacobite rising of 1715 by Tory rebels. The Whigs thoroughly purged the Tories from all major positions in government, the army, the Church of England, the legal profession and local officials. The major leader of the Whigs in this period was Robert Walpole, who maintained control of the government in the period 1721 to 1742. His protege was Henry Pelham. Both parties began as loose groupings or tendencies, but became quite formal by 1784, with the ascension of Charles James Fox as the leader of a reconstituted Whig party ranged against the governing party of the new Tories, under William Pitt the Younger. Both parties were founded on rich politicians, more than on popular votes. There were elections to the House of Commons, but a small number of men controlled most of the voters. The Whig Party slowly evolved during the 18th century. The Whig tendency supported the great aristocratic families, the Protestant Hanoverian succession, and toleration for nonconformist Protestants, while some Tories supported the exiled Stuart royal family's claim to the throne, and virtually all Tories supported the established Church of England and the gentry. Later on, the Whigs drew support from the emerging industrial interests and wealthy merchants, while the Tories drew support from the landed interests and the royal family. By the first half of the 19th century, however, the Whig political programme came to encompass not only the supremacy of Parliament over the monarch and support for free trade, but Catholic emancipation, the abolition of slavery and expansion of the franchise. Name. The term Whig was originally short for Whigamore, a term meaning cattle driver, used to describe Western Scots who came to Leith for corn. In the reign of Charles I, the term was used during Wars of the Three Kingdoms to refer derisively to a radical faction of the Scottish Covenanters, who called themselves the Kirk Party. It was then applied to Scottish Presbyterian rebels who were against the King's Episcopalian order in Scotland. The term Whig entered English political discourse during the Exclusion Bill crisis of 1678 to 1681, when there was controversy about whether or not King Charles II's brother, James, should be allowed to succeed to the throne on Charles's death. Whig was a term of abuse applied to those who wanted to exclude James on the grounds that he was a Roman Catholic. The fervent Tory Samuel Johnson often joked that the first Whig was the devil. Origins. Exclusion crisis. The Whigs, under Lord Shaftesbury's leadership, wished to exclude the Duke of York from the throne due to his Catholicism, his favouring of monarchical absolutism and his connections to France. They believed the Duke, if allowed to inherit the throne, would endanger the Protestant religion, liberty, and property. The first exclusion bill was supported by a substantial majority on its second reading in May 1679. In response, King Charles prorogued Parliament and then dissolved it, but the subsequent elections in August and September saw the Whigs' strength increase. This new Parliament did not meet for 13 months, because Charles wanted to give passions a chance to die down. When it met in October 1680, an exclusion bill was introduced and passed in the Commons without major resistance, but was rejected in the Lords. Charles dissolved Parliament in January 1681, but the Whigs did not suffer serious losses in the ensuing election. The next Parliament first met in March, at Oxford, but Charles dissolved it only after a few days. when he made an appeal to the country against the Whigs, and determined to rule without Parliament. In February, Charles had made a deal with the French King Louis XIV, who promised to support him against the Whigs. Without Parliament, the Whigs gradually crumbled, mainly due to the Rye House plot. The Earl of Melville, the Earl of Leven, Lord Shaftesbury and Charles II's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, being implicated, escaped to the United Provinces. Algernon Sidney, Sir Thomas Armstrong and William Russell, Lord Russell, were executed for treason. The Earl of Essex committed suicide in the Tower of London over his arrest for treason, whilst Lord Grey of Worcester escaped from the Tower. Glorious Revolution. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Queen Mary II and King William III governed with both Whigs and Tories. Despite the fact that many of the Tories still supported the deposed Roman Catholic James II, William saw that the Tories were generally friendlier to royal authority than the Whigs, and he employed both groups in his government. His early ministry was largely Tory, but gradually the government came to be dominated by the so-called junto Whigs, a group of younger Whig politicians who led a tightly organized political grouping. The increasing dominance of the junto led to a split among the Whigs, with the so-called country Whigs seeing the junto as betraying their principles for office. The country Whigs, led by Robert Harley, gradually merged with the Tory opposition in the later 1690s, 18th century. Although William's successor Anne had considerable Tory sympathies and excluded the junto Whigs from power, after a brief and unsuccessful experiment with an exclusively Tory government, she generally continued William's policy of balancing the parties. Supported by her moderate Tory ministers, the Duke of Marlborough and Lord Godolphin. However, as the War of the Spanish Succession went on and became less and less popular with the Tories, Marlborough and Godolphin were forced to rely more and more on the junto Whigs, so that by 1708 they headed an administration dominated by the junto. Anne herself grew increasingly uncomfortable with this dependence on the Whigs, especially as her personal relationship with the Duchess of Marlborough deteriorated. This situation also became increasingly uncomfortable to many of the non-junto Whigs, led by the Duke of Somerset and the Duke of Shrewsbury, who began to intrigue with Robert Harley's Tories in the spring of 1710, and dismissed Godolphin and the junto ministers, replacing them with Tories. The Whigs now moved into opposition and particularly decried the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, which they attempted to block through their majority in the House of Lords. The Tory administration, led by Harley and the Viscount Bolingbroke, persuaded the Queen to create 12 new Tory peers to force the treaty through. Liberal ideals. The Whigs primarily advocated the supremacy of Parliament, while calling for the toleration for Protestant dissenters. They adamantly opposed a Catholic as king. They opposed the Catholic Church because they saw it as a threat to liberty, or as the elder Pitt stated, the errors of Rome are rank idolatry, a subversion of all civil as well as religious liberty, and the utter disgrace of reason and of human nature. Ashcroft and Goldsmith have traced in detail in the period 1689 to 1710 the major influence of the liberal political ideas of John Locke on Whig political values, as expressed in widely cited manifestos such as Political Aphorisms, or The True Maxims of Government Displayed, an anonymous pamphlet that appeared in 1690 and was widely cited by Whigs. The 18th century Whigs borrowed the concepts and language of universal rights employed by political theorists Locke and Algernon Sidney. By the 1770s, the ideas of Adam Smith, a founder of classical liberalism, became important, as Wilson and Real note. Adam Smith's theory melded nicely with the liberal political stance of the Whig Party and its middle-class constituents. Samuel Johnson, a leading London intellectual, repeatedly denigrated the vile Whigs and praised the Tories, even during the times of Whig political supremacy. In his Great Dictionary, Johnson defined a Tory as one who adheres to the ancient constitution of the state and the apostolical hierarchy of the Church of England. Opposed to a Whig, he linked 18th-century Whiggism with 17th-century revolutionary Puritanism, arguing that the Whigs of his day were similarly inimical to the established order of church and state. Johnson recommended that strict uniformity in religious externals was the best antidote to the objectionable religious traits that he linked to Whiggism. Protectionism. From their inception, the Whigs were strongly protectionist in economic policy, with free trade policies being advocated by Tories. The Whigs were opposed to the pro-French policies of the Stuart kings Charles II and James II, as they believed that such an alliance with the Catholic absolute monarchy of France endangered liberty and Protestantism. The Whigs claimed that trade with France was bad for England and developed an economic theory of overbalance, that is, a deficit of trade with France was bad because it would enrich France at England's expense. In 1678, the Whigs passed the Prohibition of 1678 that banned certain French goods from being imported into England. It was repealed upon the accession of James II by a Tory-dominated House of Commons, but upon the accession of William III a new act was passed that prohibited the importation of French goods. The Whigs passed the Trade with France Act 1704 that renewed protectionism against France. However, in 1710 Queen Anne appointed the mostly Tory Harley Ministry, which favoured free trade. When the Tory Lord Bolingbroke proposed a commercial treaty with France in 1713 that would lead to freer trade, the Whigs were vehemently against it, and it had to be abandoned. In 1786, Pitt's government negotiated the Eden Agreement, a commercial treaty with France which led to freer trade between the two countries. All of the Whig leaders attacked this on traditional Whig anti-French and protectionist grounds. Fox claimed that France was England's natural enemy and that it was only at Britain's expense that she could grow. Edmund Burke, Richard Sheridan, William Wyndham and Charles Grey all spoke out against the trade agreement on the same grounds. Ashley claimed that the traditional policy of the Whig Party from before the Revolution of 1688 down to the time of Fox was an extreme form of protectionism. The Whigs' protectionism of this period is today increasingly cited with approval by heterodox economists such as Ha-Joon Chang, who wish to challenge contemporary prevailing free trade orthodoxies via precedents from the past. Whig supremacy. With the succession in 1714 of Elector George Louis of Hanover as King George I, the Whigs returned to government. The Jacobite Rising of 1715 discredited much of the Tory party as traitorous Jacobites, and Whig control of the levers of power, e.g., through the Septennial Act, ensured that the Whigs became the dominant party of government. During the long period between 1714 and 1760, the Tories practically died out as an active political force, although they always retained a considerable presence in the House of Commons. The governments of Robert Walpole and the Pelhams, Henry Pelham and his older brother the Duke of Newcastle, between them ruled between 1721 and 1756, and the leading elements in these governments consistently referred to themselves as Whigs. George III's accession. This arrangement changed during the reign of George III, who hoped to restore his own power by freeing himself from the great Whig magnates. Thus, George promoted his old tutor, Lord Bute, to power and broke with the old Whig leadership surrounding the Duke of Newcastle. After a decade of factional chaos, with distinct Grenvilleite, Bedfordite, Rockinghamite, and Chathamite factions successively in power, and all referring to themselves as Whigs, a new system emerged with two separate opposition groups. The Rockingham Whigs claimed the mantle of Old Whigs, as the purported successors of the party of the Pelhams and the great Whig families, with such noted intellectuals as Edmund Burke behind him. The Rockingham Whigs laid out a philosophy which for the first time extolled the virtues of faction, or at least their faction. The other group were the followers of Lord Chatham, who, as the great political hero of the 7 Years' War, generally took a stance of opposition to party and faction. The Whigs were opposed by the government of Lord North, which they accused of being a Tory administration. Although it largely consisted of individuals previously associated with the Whigs, many old Pelhamites, as well as the Bedfordite Whig faction formerly led by the Duke of Bedford, and elements of that which had been led by George Grenville. Although it also contained elements of the King's Men, the group formerly associated with Lord Bute, which was generally seen as Tory-leaning. American impact. The association of Toryism with Lord North's government was also influential in the American colonies. Writings of British political commentators known as the Radical Whigs did much to stimulate colonial Republican sentiment. Early activists in the colonies called themselves Whigs, seeing themselves as in alliance with the political opposition in Britain, until they turned to independence and started emphasizing the label Patriots. Later, the United States Whig Party was founded in 1833, focused on opposition to a strong presidency, just as the British Whigs had opposed a strong monarchy. Two-party system. Dickinson reports that all historians are agreed that the Tory party declined sharply in the late 1740s and 1750s and that it ceased to be an organized party by 1760. The research of Sir Lewis Namier and his disciples has convinced all historians that there were no organized political parties in Parliament between the late 1750s and the early 1780s. Even the Whigs ceased to be an identifiable party, and Parliament was dominated by competing political connections, which all proclaimed Whiggish political views, or by independent backbenchers unattached to any particular group. The North administration left power in March 1782 following the American Revolution, and a coalition of the Rockingham Whigs and the former Chathamites, now led by the Earl of Shelburne, took its place. After Rockingham's unexpected death in July 1782, this uneasy coalition fell apart, with Charles James Fox, Rockingham's successor as faction leader, quarreling with Shelburne and withdrawing his supporters from the government. The following Shelburne administration was short-lived, however, and in April 1783, Fox returned to power, this time in an unexpected coalition with his old enemy Lord North. Although this pairing seemed unnatural to many at the time, it was to last beyond the demise of the coalition in December 1783. The coalition's untimely fall was brought about by George III in league with the House of Lords, and the King now brought in Chatham's son, William Pitt the Younger, as his Prime Minister. It was only now that a genuine two-party system can be seen to emerge, with Pitt and the government on the one side, and the ousted Fox-North coalition on the other. On the 17th of December 1783, Fox stated in the House of Commons that, if a change must take place, and a new ministry is to be formed and supported, not by the confidence of this House or the public but the sole authority of the Crown, I, for one, shall not envy that hon. gentleman his situation. From that moment I put in my claim for a monopoly of Whig principles. Although Pitt is often referred to as a Tory, and Fox as a Whig, Pitt always considered himself to be an independent Whig, and generally opposed the development of a strict partisan political system. Fox's supporters, however, certainly saw themselves as legitimate heirs of the Whig tradition, and they were strongly opposed to Pitt in his early years in office. Notably during the Regency crisis revolving around the King's temporary insanity in 1788 to 1789, when Fox and his allies supported full powers for their ally, the Prince of Wales, as regent. The opposition Whigs were split, however, by the onset of the French Revolution, while Fox and some younger members of the party such as Charles Grey and Richard Brinsley Sheridan were sympathetic to the French revolutionaries. Others, led by Edmund Burke, were strongly opposed. Although Burke himself was largely alone in defecting to Pitt in 1791, much of the rest of the party, including the influential House of Lords leader in the Duke of Portland, Rockingham's nephew Lord Fitzwilliam, and William Wyndham, were increasingly uncomfortable with the flirtations of Fox and his allies with radicalism and the French Revolution. They split in early 1793 with Fox over the question of support for the war with France, and by the end of the year they had openly broken with Fox. By the summer of the next year, large portions of the opposition had defected and joined Pitt's government.